let's just get started. So I'll be posting this recording on Schoology like I normally do, just in case you want to go back and take a look. You're always allowed to do that. But I'll be doing, like I said before, I think in the early part of the week, I wanted to do live lessons so that people who are at home kind of learn better live. They can join up and be with us as we do this. So uh, that's kind of the general feeling here. So one of the first things you notice when it comes to how Congress is now taking an approach to Reconstruction, because we saw several different plans going forward, and obviously Lincoln being dead, Johnson versus Congress becomes the main stage, like the battleground between what's going to go moving forward. And Congress starts to feel as if Johnson is basically going against everything in which they're trying to push forward. So one of the first things that they do, and I'm sure you remember from yesterday, is the fact that the Reconstruction Acts basically put military personnel within the southern states to kind of enforce a lot of the policies that Congress wanted to get done, specifically when it comes to the 14th Amendment and other such bills that were essential to Congress's plan. So when this occurs, now remember, the president is the chief of military. So for Congress to basically station troops throughout the South is kind of going against the whole purpose of what Johnson is, right? He's the one that kind of mobilizes troops. And if he's against Congress's actions, this could be a big deal. Now, on top of that, Congress passes this Tenure of Office Act, which basically stops Johnson from really stopping them. Specifically, it stops him from firing any sort of cabinet level position or Senate approval position without them agreeing to it. So for instance, the Secretary of War is a position where the Senate has to approve because it's the cabinet level position. And the Secretary of War would be somebody that would control the military in the South. So by passing this law, it kind of was their way to secure the Reconstruction Acts. So Johnson, I'm sure you read in the document, had challenged this ruling by firing the Secretary of War. The House responds with impeachment, right? They throw at him 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors, and he was considered the first president to ever be impeached. And now it goes to the Senate trial. Now, the Senate fell one vote short of removing him from office. And the reason why is because moderate Republicans, people that were kind of in the middle of this whole thing, felt as if this was going to be a bad precedent being set forward because they technically would be removing Johnson for just a policy issue or political reasons rather than something drastic, something major happening. So they did not go forward with removal. Now, at the same time, though, when the elections come around and someone's impeached, it doesn't necessarily help their odds. So now Johnson is up for election, but the Democrats do not push him forward as being their candidate because they realize that if they did so, it wouldn't even be close. And I think in general, anyway, the Democrats don't really have much of a chance in this point. The Republicans put forward Ulysses S. Grant, who remember is the general that was crucial to the win in the Civil War, who implemented the total war concept. So he was kind of seen as somebody that was a war hero. Now, granted, when you look at Grant, he has no political experience. He's not really been someone to kind of do a lot of diplomacy when it comes to making deals with politicians. So it was kind of a very risky move. And we'll go into why it really wasn't the smartest thing to do for Grant. But between the two, Grant was the victor. And this was by a landslide. And the reason why this was a landslide was because at this point, the African-American vote really helped Grant win, right? Because obviously the Republican Party was pushing forward to ending slavery. They were the ones trying to push for citizenship. So those African-Americans now were able to be involved, help the Republicans win, all right? Now, to kind of make sure that this major victory, and let me hide this so you can see, this major victory in the elections was going to help actually continue in the future, one of the first things they do was pass the 15th Amendment, which was help secure the African-American vote. They wanted to do this on a very large scale throughout the entire South as well, because Now, when you pass certain civil rights laws in the North, they follow easily, but in the South, remember, they're always challenging a lot of these bills being passed. So with a amendment being put in place, it now gives the government more teeth in combating in the southern states trying to oppress the vote. Okay. Um, Now, the last Civil Rights Act passed during Reconstruction would be the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which would somewhat guarantee accommodations for African Americans in public places. But unfortunately, we'll notice this as we go a little bit further down the line. This is not really enforced. And we'll talk about the reasons why it wasn't enforced. Um, you'll learn pretty quickly that with Grant becoming president, there's a lot of issues that emerge. And specifically, one of the issues that we'll focus on is obviously this greater divide that starts to emerge. And also Grant, his presidency is basically seen as entirely corrupt. Not saying Grant himself was corrupt, but the people around him were extremely corrupt. But let's focus on the South first. So in the South, obviously, the whites had dominated basically all facets of politics. Hey, so they dominated all facets of politics, and pretty quickly, the ex-Confederate leaders started to become back into power. Now, the interesting thing though is that even this being the case, the fact that the ex-Confederates are back into power and everything, there were actually a lot of cases where African Americans had won seats in different spots. Specifically in the House, they had won more than a dozen in the House, and others they actually had won in state assemblies and state elections. So this was actually a pretty big accomplishment, pretty big achievement to be looking forward. However, as I mentioned before, the tensions kept arising between the two major parties. Specifically, those Democrats in the South would target a lot of times Southern Republicans. So people that were obviously, remember, Republicans are mainly in the North. And also you can say people that were originally from the North that moved to the South. And when you look at the two probably most famous terms of kind of showing this anger toward them, scallywags would be considered those that were Southern Republicans, people that they deemed to be like the enemy, right? Because they were against them in politics. And then carpetbaggers were actually Northerners that fled to the South to basically use this post-war like destruction a way for them to make money. Okay. Now, when it comes to African Americans, they are now creating communities because at the end of the day, there's still a lot of racial tension going on in the South, as in African Americans are not really seen part of society still. So they kind of have to make their own society. You start to see a lot more communities of color start to emerge, specifically when it revolves around religion. You see a break off and a forming of Baptist and Methodist Episcopal churches. And on top of that, education starts to really spark in these communities where it's going to be mainly all Black schools. And you can see this happening on the college level and also on the just general public school levels, right? And you see when it comes to Howard University, Atlanta, Fisk, and Morehouse, these are all started during this era, okay? So understand that because of the fact the South was still so divided when it comes to the enforcement of a lot of the bills, the Reconstruction bills and civil rights bills, you started to see basically African Americans have to try to fight for themselves because there's a lot of other things that start to happen that cause Congress to focus away from Reconstruction and focus in on other issues that are plaguing their society. For instance, the Ku Klux Klan becomes a major problem during this era. It officially starts in 1867 by ex-Confederate General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. But this group ends up gaining a lot of support amongst Southern Democrats. Basically, this group is as we all know today, is basically a terrorist group at this point. Their whole purpose was to intimidate, obviously, Southern Republicans, abolitionists, African Americans, all to basically stop them from either pushing for civil rights or just voting in general. And we'll see how basically Congress attempts to kind of give the federal government ability to fight back against them, but understand that you need help from state authorities. But when state authorities are either part of the Ku Klux Klan or aiding them, it's going to be nearly impossible to completely stop them, right? And we'll talk more about this group as time progresses, but this is really where it starts to emerge. Now, in the North, when things are not looking so great in the South, the North doesn't really look that good either. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, Grant's administration is plagued with greed, as in corruption is taking rampant all over politics. And in the North, you see this happen probably more than anywhere else. And the reason why is because there are a lot of instances where politicians were kind of in bed with the rich in all facets, whether it was trying to scheme the market for like trying to sell like bonds to gain access to the railroad or things like that, or trying to think, or really, well, trying to think of the other one. We'll get to it. I just forgot what I was thinking about, but basically this is on a giant level, right? You'll see some instances or examples of Boss Tweed in New York City, and these are some famous cartoons of him. Basically, he had controlled all politics within New York, and then obviously, when basically he has all this money that he can kind of use to influence politicians, he can now control the bills or different acts being passed. And this is happening on a larger scale, even to the federal government level. As I mentioned, Grant's administration was plagued with this on all scales. Grant himself wasn't involved, but even his brother became a big issue, to the point where we started to see even and probably one of the most famous incident was the Credit Mobile affair, which was basically people were investing in the Transcontinental Railroad, and they were overhyping basically the investment, how it's going to pay off. And then when people would start to buy in and wanted to basically join in on this buy, they would the people that started the investments would then sell off their parts and just basically take all the money for themselves. And at the end of the day, the people that were investing in were not getting enough money for what they put in. As in, it's almost like looking at the modern day stock market, where it's like people were manipulating the stock market for their own benefit, while other people that put their money in and stay on that stock are going to crash. So it's almost like that type of idea. And people started to do this all the time. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to actually become a major thing we'll talk about in Unit 6. But the point is that corruption is at an all-time high in the North. Now, even with all this happening, people still believed in Grant, which was wild, in my opinion. The fact is, when you look at Grant's administration, it's only been negative up until this point. But the fact that there wasn't really any other better candidates basically caused people to have to side with Grant. Now, many of the more radicalized Republicans, the liberal Republicans, wanted to have basically a change, a more progressive stance on a lot of these issues. They actually had supported Horace Greeley, who was the New York Tribune writer that we actually talked about when Lincoln had first confronted him about, because he wanted to go to war a lot sooner than everyone else. They pushed him to be the next president. And just think of that. The New York Tribune author was being nominated for president. So that tells you the general sense of candidates and how really good they were. Grant was obviously not the best, but he was already there. It's like the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And Grant kind of won by a landslide when it comes to just looking at all these different candidates nominated, right? All these different Democratic candidates, he was the only clear-cut Republican one that was put forward. Now, with basically Grant still being in as president, it only gets worse. And one of the biggest things that happens is the Panic of 1873. And I'll try to explain this to you, and it might be confusing in some way because it's not necessarily all in the United States, like it's their problem. It's actually seen as the first Great Depression that emerges all across the world. And the reason why it actually occurs is because, first off, everyone was investing into the Transcontinental Railroad, right? It started during Lincoln's presidency, but it was growing ever since. And we'll talk about it in detail, like I said, in the next unit. But everyone was investing a lot of bonds into the Transcontinental Railroad. And in Germany, across the seas, they changed the money, what money is based off of. It used to be gold and silver. But now they changed it. Basically, the value of the dollar is now only on gold. The United States was like the only place in the general region where everyone was trading with one another that still had their money based on gold and silver. So when silver was now in excess, as in no one was really using silver for their money, for their hard money, it became like worthless. So now America's dollar changed in its value, and people started to lose out on a lot of their investments, a lot of their bonds they had put in place, and they really in certain banks, specifically the Bank of Jay Cooke, which was the biggest bank at the time, who had a lot of investments in the Transcontinental Railroad and other things. When that value of money changed completely, and people were trying to take out their money, they couldn't pay back all the money that they were trying to remove, and they had collapsed. When the largest bank in the United States collapses and all those people lose their money, bad things start to occur. And the question it really is then, how do you stop this? So basically the only way they could do this is to change the value of the money, of the dollar, to now be based on just solely gold alone. And that's what Grant kind of pushes forward. Now, the impact of this is that this is the first real Great Depression. Now, we don't name it a Great Depression, but it was one. The fact that not only was it involved in the United States, but in other European nations around the world does kind of show that it is a Great Depression. Now, it's not the same level as the one we all know of, but it does consider itself being an economic crisis that happens all across the world. Now, because of this, a lot of other chain reaction events start to occur. Firstly, when people lose out on all their money, they become very homeless. Congress now looks at this and saying, this is priority number one when it comes to what we should be dealing with as a nation, instead of the current crisis that they're going through, which is Reconstruction. When Reconstruction has been the major, issue that all of the United States has been dealing with, whether it was the president or Congress, where basically had an entire new emerging group of the United States, the African Americans, basically did not have any sort of rights or any real, chance of being successful. And now this happens. They're saying, yeah, we have to deal with this crisis, and they kind of push Reconstruction to the back burner. They say, yeah, we can't deal with that right now, and it causes other bad things to happen. For instance, the KKK was being a target for Congress at this time, but with the panic of 1873 occurring, it causes now Congress to look away from that. And the KKK now reemerges as being a dominant force in the South. Now, granted, they were already pretty strong, but now that Congress is not really attacking them or targeting them, that means they can do whatever they want. And that's kind of the biggest downside you can see from this. Now, to look at the end of Reconstruction, it really culminates around the election of 1876. And I'll explain to you kind of the situation that's going on. Now, obviously, Grant is now not going to be running anymore, right? He's done. He's filled his 2 terms. It's over. Now they have to find somebody new that's going to be the next great leader of the country. So by 1876, federal troops were basically withdrawn from all but 3 states, southern states. That was South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And the Democrats had basically returned all to power to ex-Confederate members or leaders all throughout those states, right? Now, Rutherford B. Hayes was being nominated by the Republicans to be president. Samuel J. Tilden was for the Democrats, and it was a pretty close election, as you can tell. The electoral votes, extremely, extremely close. Now, the Democrats had won the majority when it came to the popular vote, but the electoral vote, they only needed 1 point from one of those 3 states that I just mentioned. Now, at the time, remember, when they're under federal occupation of soldiers, the Republican Party had it where they were in control until they were allowed to join back into the normal, the day-to-day in which the other states were allowed to join back into. So at the time, those 3 states were controlled by Republicans, and they voted in a very tight vote to give the vote, their 1 electoral vote, to the Republicans, to Hayes. So basically, it was like a little bit of a interesting corrupt scandal here. With that happening, the Democrats were threatening to basically have a filibuster to say, we're going to challenge the election, and we are going to send the vote to the House, just like how normal tight elections happen when no one's the clear winner. And if that happened, the Democrats would have won. But there is a secret deal that occurs. This is known as the Compromise of 1877. So they form a deal. The deal would be that Hayes would become the president, but in exchange, there would be the ending of the federal support of the troops stationed in all the states in the South. Basically, they would have to draw everyone out of there. And secondly, they would support building a transcontinental railroad in the southern states. Okay. By doing this, it now gives the southern states full control over their own state again, with no regards to continuing Reconstruction. And it will allow them to now have better access to trading their farming materials to these ports. So Hayes is now the president. The South really gained back their control and now has new ways of making money. But because of this, Reconstruction ends. This is how it is officially over. So when you take a look at now evaluating this, let's look at how would you evaluate Reconstruction accomplishments. Firstly, you could say that because of Republican control over the southern state constitutions, they updated them. They made sure that this involved more people. There was more male suffrage than ever before. When it comes to women's rights, they did get a lot better because of these updated constitutions. Did provide women for property rights, debt relief in the South for other people. They built more modernized infrastructure, so it had more roads, bridges, trains. These are all things you could say. More modernized institutions like hospitals, school systems, asylums. They never really had those things updated before. Failures? Corruption was horrible. And as I just mentioned before, politicians were bought on a daily basis, both in the North and the South. And there was never really a full civil rights accomplishment that that Congress was fully trying to do when the Civil War had ended. Basically, this left African Americans in a spot of limbo, right? Basically, they gave them the ability to vote, but they didn't really have any protections to help them secure that right in the South. So you're going to see for generations that this is going to be rampant. And even in some cases, it's not really the same thing as back then, but there are still some cases of we still see voter suppression happen. And that's still a problem. It's never just fully taken care of. And you can kind of blame that on Reconstruction. If, let's just say, Lincoln was the president, do you think that Reconstruction would be different? What do you think? You think it'd be exactly the same? Slightly better? Yeah, Aaron. How so?
It would have been a lot more unified because it seems like there's a lot of experience and people wanted to do it, but Lincoln was like more moderate.
Yeah, so I mean that's the general point of view for a lot of historians. A lot of people say if Lincoln was alive, now granted he wouldn't still be the president all the way through the Grant's administration, but Johnson's divided administration probably wouldn't be that way. And kind of starting out strong probably would have carried over to other administrations. And that's generally the idea. So when you're evaluating Reconstruction, that's how you should really think about it, right? And now, granted, you can have your own opinions about it, but I'm just generally giving you some positives and clearly the negatives of Reconstruction, right? Okay, well, we are complete with Unit 5. Feels like it's been forever, I'm sure. Think of it this way. And I think I say this every class. I made this myself, 163 slides later. That's a lot. And just you can see the bags under my eyes. You can tell that's a lot there. But the point is that we are now done. What I will allow you to do we actually finished pretty early, is you can create your study guides. I posted that today. So if you have that ready to go, you can actually submit that and you can get started on the ed puzzle that I posted. If not, you can actually get started on your study guide right now so that you can get those bonus points for the test. Okay.